We have all been challenged and have struggled in our own way this past year. From celebrating holidays without loved ones to not being able to go to shul to daven or to say Kaddish to experiencing real hardships in our family, in our community, in our country, and our world. And for us in the Jewish community, this year has had an added difficulty and an added sadness as we have suffered the loss of some of the greatest Gedolim and greatest Torah leaders of our generation. Rav Steinsaltz, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, Rav Nachum Eliezer Rabinovich, Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, Rabbi David Feinstein, and so many others, all of blessed memory. And these men, however, they weren't just great scholars or Rosh Yeshiva. They were leaders of our community. They were role models for how to live engaging and meaningful Jewish lives in this modern world. They taught and they inspired thousands upon thousands of students. And on a personal note, I have struggled immensely with the weight of this loss. These rabbis, they meant so much to me personally. The very first time that I ever studied Gemara, the time that I first fell in love with Talmud, it was when I was in elementary school and we used a Steinsaltz Gemara that was put together by Rav Steinsaltz himself. And when teaching classes, I've used this English translation from Koren more times than I can count. I spent a gap year in Israel and I studied in Malay Adumim, where Rav Nachum Eliezer Rabinovich was the Rosh Yeshiva. In a time of my life that was so formative, Rav Rabinovich was a role model and how I could live my life. His creativity, halachic, agadic, it just knew no bounds. He was a master of almost every secular subject, especially in the sciences, and he helped me think about how to synthesize Torah knowledge in a modern world. He was always available to chat with a chutznik, with one of the few Americans like myself in the yeshiva. And most importantly, Rav Rabinovich challenged me to ask better questions and to be courageous in seeking their answers. His passion for Israel, for intellectual honesty, and for engaging with the real issues in the community, it all knew no bounds. And after studying in Malay Adumim with Rav Rabinovich, I was now ready to study at Yeshiva University under the leadership and the wisdom of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb. I'm lucky enough to say that my klaf, my rabbinic certificate, was one of the last sets that Rabbi Lamb signed personally. And the environment that he created for every student at YU to learn and to grow and to be a leader, it helped shape my identity and my passion for the Jewish community. And it was there at YU that I first discovered the books of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. I remember being on a Shabbaton once and a friend sharing with me his own worn-out, underlined copy of the book To Heal a Fractured World. And as a young rabbi, Rabbi Sacks's insights into the Parsha and into philosophy were gold. He just so effortlessly, he showed the beauty and the value of traditional Judaism and the way and the power of making it accessible to anybody and everybody. I remember once hearing him speak at Lamport Auditorium at Yeshiva University, and it just brought me to tears being in his presence. The way in which he spoke, you could listen to him for hours upon hours. And when our paths, when they later crossed when I was working at New York University, I relished the opportunity to continue to listen to his wisdom, to his moral and strong values. And so for me, the last few months, they have been very hard. 4 of the most influential rabbis in my life have passed away, rabbis that have served as my role models, as Torah teachers for me, as guides not only for me, but for so many others as well. And so as I'm trying to process this grief and this immense sadness, I find great solace in, unsurprisingly, one of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks's commentaries actually on this week's Parsha. You see, perhaps the detail that stands out the most about this week's Parsha is the painstaking detail that the Torah goes to describe the small details of every section of the Parsha. As we know, our Parsha this week, it begins with the death of Sarah. Abraham cries, and he mourns over his beloved partner and his wife, but then he immediately just jumps into action. And the Torah describes every single detail of his negotiation with Ephron for an appropriate and a respectful burial plot for Sarah. He barters and he insists on paying the absolute full price, and he buys the Marat HaMachpelah. And following the story of Avram's purchase, we once again see him jump into action. And once again, the Torah goes into great detail, recording every conversation, every detail in the story that is to unfold. And this time, Avram is sending out his trusty servant Eliezer to find a wife for his son Yitzchak. And Rabbi Jonathan Sacks explains that our Parsha goes into more detail than almost anywhere else in the Torah regarding these stories about buying land for the burial plot and finding a wife for Yitzchak, to call our attention to something so significant. And he explains that throughout the narrative of Avram's life, we see that God promises him really two things: children and land. And Avram, we know, is going to be a father to many nations. He's going to have descendants. They'll be as numerous as the dust of the earth and the stars of the sky. And he's promised time and again that the land of Canaan is going to be his. And yet, when Sarah dies, Avram has not seen either of those two promises fulfilled. He doesn't have a single inch of land that he can call his own. And he only has one child in Yitzchak, who will continue the covenant and yet is currently unmarried. And the Torah goes to great lengths to give us the details of Abraham's actions. In the words of Rabbi Sacks, quote, "The Torah slows down the speed of the narrative so that we will not miss the point. God promises, but we have to act. God promised Avram the land, but he had to buy the first field. God promised Avram many descendants, but Avram had to ensure that his son was married and to a woman who would share the life of the covenant so that Avram would have, as he liked to say, Jewish grandchildren. And despite all the promises, God does not and will not do it alone. Noah has to build the ark himself to be saved. The Jewish people have to battle to conquer the land of Israel. And what changes the world, what fulfills our destiny, is not what God does for us, but rather what we do for God. And that's what leaders understand. It's what makes Avram the first Jewish leader, for that matter, because leaders take responsibility for creating the conditions through which God's purposes can be fulfilled. They're not passive, but rather active even later in life, like we see in Avram in our Parsha. But the truth is, what really stands out from our Parsha is that large promises like land and children, they can only become real through small beginnings, by purchasing a small plot of land, by finding your son a wife. You see, leaders have a vision for the future, but they also know that there are no shortcuts. Abraham dies satisfied knowing that he's left something for the next generation to build on. And in the words of Rabbi Sacks, quote, "All great change is the work of more than one generation, and none of us will live to see the full fruit of our endeavors. Leaders see the destination, they begin the journey, and leave behind them those who will continue it. That is enough to endow a life with immortality." Friends, these Torah giants like Rabbi Laura Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Rev. Rabinovich, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, and so many others, they embody this notion of leadership and live on through all of us. They have all left an incredible foundation and, most importantly, a mission for all of us to continue to share and to bring Torah and Judaism and the divine presence into this world. Shabbat Shalom.